So we will explore the Adventist past together at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I hope that you're gaining some information, but also some inspiration as I share with you the exciting history of how God has led in the past here in Indiana. Those of you who were not here a month ago, we did cover the 1850s and the 1860s, and today we're ready to break into the 1870s, which is when the Indiana Conference is formed. And so this coming summer at your camp meeting in June, we will be celebrating together the 150th anniversary of the Indiana Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. So I've entitled the section on the 1870s, The Organizing Saints. Although nearly all of Indiana's ministerial workforce between 1850 and 1870 had been borrowed or imported from other states, in the spring of 1870, the Michigan Conference granted Charles Seward of Howard County, Indiana, a preaching, or we would call it today, a ministerial license to improve his spiritual gifts. Seward was joined in 1871 by two other Hoosiers granted ministerial licenses, William Covert and W. Sharp. These three men, plus Sands Lane, an ordained minister laboring in Indiana but living in Battle Creek, constituted the evangelistic team in this state prior to 1872. And we'll have some more to share with you about Sands Lane, because he had a physical handicap that he used to rejoice would be removed when he went to heaven. And so we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then on December 19, 1871, the General Conference Committee recommended that the churches in Indiana be organized into the Indiana Conference. At the Michigan Conference session of September 5, 1872, the delegates chose Sands Lane and W.H. Littlejohn to attend the next Indiana camp meeting and to assist in forming this brand new conference. 2 weeks later, with GC President George I. Butler in the chair and Sands Lane as secretary, the Indiana Conference of Seventh-day Adventists was established on September the 20th. The delegates voted to accept the same constitution that Michigan, Wisconsin, and New York had previously adopted. And then they chose William Covert as their first president, James Harvey as their first secretary, and Isaac Zirkle, who had immigrated from Virginia in the 1850s, as their first treasurer. They also voted the churches at North Liberty, Alto, Irvin, Salem Center, and Patricksburg into membership in the Indiana Conference. And finally, they passed a resolution to give expression to the gratitude which we feel toward our brethren up in Michigan, in view of the affectionate watch care which they have so long exercised over the cause in this state. The delegates also sent a thank you gift of $100. Now today that would be equivalent to $2,500 to the General Conference, and they organized the Indiana State Tract and Missionary Society. So that's one of the oldest institutions in the state of Indiana for Seventh-day Adventists, is a Tract and Missionary Society, which we today call the Adventist Book Centers. And you still have that. I buy books down there in Cicero because I can't buy them up in Michigan. We don't have an ABC anymore in Berrien Springs or in Lansing either. After 1872, conference sessions met during the annual camp meetings. In 1873, the delegates re-elected William Covert as president and Isaac Zirkle as treasurer. But they chose William Carpenter this time as their secretary. Covert and Sharp were also licensed ministers. the attendees passed a very interesting resolution that we deplore our condition spiritually, and we feel anxious to rise and occupy that position where we may have more of a lively interest in every department of this work, and that we will seek the spirit of sacrifice that will be acceptable to God. Their spirit of sacrifice becomes evident when you realize that during the previous 1 year, Adventists here in Indiana had given nearly $930 in systematic benevolence funds. Now that's equivalent to around $25,000 today. And as we learned last time, there were so few, just a few dozen Adventists in Indiana. Systematic benevolence, by the way, is an early form of tithing, but it was based on the increase that you had from 1 year to the next. You paid 10% of the increase rather than 10% of your total income. That $930, by the way, would be the highest amount that Adventists in Indiana donated during the entire decade of the 1870s. Delegates came from 7 churches, adding Mechanicsburg and Rochester, convened at Rails Grove in September of 1874. Rails Grove, as I understand it, is a little tiny village or hamlet near Kokomo. You don't find it on the map today. And they elected James Harvey as president, William Carpenter as secretary, Isaac Zirkel as treasurer. So the Indiana Conference now had 4 licensed ministers. But there was a cash balance in the conference treasury of only $16.84. In 1875, when the 3 officers were reelected, the number of churches had risen to 11, adding Bunker Hill, Ligonier, Wolf Lake, and Bourbon. And forgive me if I don't pronounce these the way you Hoosiers do. I have a French-English tongue. Jesse will correct me afterwards. But the annual systematic benevolence donations had dropped to about $500. At the 1876 session in Peru, 10 churches sent delegates who reelected James Harvey as president and Isaac Zirkel as treasurer, but they chose the first woman, Margaret Faddock, as conference secretary. I don't imagine you've had very many women serve as conference secretary, but you did have one 150 years ago. Margaret Faddock was her name. The 50 cents a week, the balance in the treasury had increased to $558, and even the young people were urged to give between 5 and 50 cents a week to the systematic benevolence. Attendees voted to support the new college at Battle Creek and to give 1% of their income to build new meeting houses and to patch the aging evangelistic tents. Perhaps one notable action taken at the 1877 session near Kokomo was the ordination of Arthur W. Bartlett by Sands Lane and Joseph Wagner. So Bartlett thus became the first ordained Hoosier Adventist minister in this conference, A.W. Bartlett. And it now included 13 churches, with the addition of the Marian Church and the West Liberty Church. Returning to Kokomo in 1878, the delegates chose Sands Lane as their president and Dr. William Hill as their treasurer, but they reelected Margaret Faddock as their conference secretary. So the conference now boasted 18 churches, with the addition of Peoria, Darlington, Yorktown, Deedsville, and Bloomington. It had 4 credentialed ministers, William Covert, W.W. Sharp, Alfred Sweet, and a new one, J.M. Rees. And it had 4 licensed ministers, Lloyd Caldwell, Victor Thompson, J.T. Richards, and J.S. Schrock. Dr. Hill noted that systematic benevolence contributions had fallen still farther to about $300, and there was only $72 cash in the conference safe. Meanwhile, newly ordained Arthur W. Bartlett was warned to cease preaching his peculiar views on sanctification because some of the ministers deemed them rather extreme. He also received a rebuke from Ellen White about that, and so Elder Bartlett agreed to cease teaching his peculiar views. At the Rochester camp meeting in 1879, the delegates from 20 churches, which now included Noblesville, Arcadia, and Frankton, re-elected Sands Lane as president, J.S. Schrock as secretary, and Dr. William Hill as treasurer. After Dr. Hill reported, the conference treasury was now up to $168. The delegates voted their approval of the brand new tithing plan. That came in 1879. Tithing on the income that you earned every year instead of the increase from one year to the next. That was the major difference. They also voted to boost participation in the health and temperance movement and to establish an education relief fund to send more of their young men and young women to Battle Creek College. The Indiana Conference ended the decade with 4 credentialed ordained ministers and 5 licensed ones. Now, these 9 preachers, eager to spread the Adventist message, entered many new areas of the state. In 1870, Elbert and Ellen Lane, and Elbert's brother, who was Sands Lane, pitched their tent in New London, Roosevelt, Sugar Creek, Moores Creek, Spencer, Patricksburg, Lancaster, Burlington, and Nineveh. Those of you familiar with the map of Indiana recognize that most of these places are little one-horse villages. Our Adventist pioneers loved to go to the small places. They avoided Indianapolis entirely. They liked farmers. They liked mechanics. They liked the rural people. And that's why they went to these tiny little villages. In many of these places, however, local newspapers advertised their tent meetings and printed their 2-hour discourses. Adventists didn't call them sermons quite yet. The Lanes expressed themselves happily disappointed. That's one of my favorite Victorian phrases. If you're happily disappointed, something good happened that you weren't expecting to happen. All right? Try to work that into a conversation this week with somebody near you. Oh, I was happily disappointed. I got more Christmas presents than I expected, right? That would be an appropriate time to use it. Happily disappointed at the size of their audiences. And you're not going to believe the numbers that I'm going to share with you. But these come out of the reports to the newspapers of the day and the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. 600 Lutherans, Mennonites, Dunkards, Mormons, Methodists, and Disciples of Christ, who were called Campbellites back then, came to Lancaster tent meetings. 500 attended the Burlington tent meetings. Between 90 and 100 converts to Seventh-day Adventism came out of those meetings. During 1871, Elbert Lane and his assistant, a brother Randolph, preached in schoolhouses and churches across Howard and Henry counties, baptizing 29 souls from their efforts in Sulphur Spring, Blue River, Lancaster, and Circlesville. Meanwhile, Charles Seward lectured at the Mason Schoolhouse in Howard County, while Sands Lane and his assistant, Ezra Brackett, preached at Bowling Green, Gosport, Patricksburg, and Freedom, converting dozens to the Advent message. The peripatetic preacher Joseph Wagner, he just seemed to be everywhere. That's why I call him peripatetic. He pops up in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. He's all over the place. Joseph Wagner shared the gospel in Smithville, Gosport, Lancaster, Bowling Green, Fairfield, Big Wildcat Creek, and Spencer in 1872. I might inject here, so many of the places they went had the name Creek after them. You must have a lot of creeks in Indiana. I don't know the map that well, but so many places had the name Creek after them. They preached in public schoolhouses, Baptist churches, despite he was suffering a bad cold at the time too. He also admonished believers down in southern Indiana for being too slow to take hold of this part of the work. Southern Indiana was the last area developed by Seventh-day Adventists. The following year, Sands Lane entered Howard County, Michigantown, Rossville, and Mechanicsburg, where his discourses were heard by between 100 and 400 listeners at each place. Meanwhile, at his brother Albert's meetings, believers wept publicly, repented of their sins, and 7 of them requested baptism, which Albert performed despite recently being discharged from the Battle Creek Sanitarium after a serious illness. In 1874, Sands Lane carried the message of the 3 angels throughout Steuben, Henry, and Fulton counties, preaching in Rochester, Bunker Hill, and Bourbon, where he was joined by J.H. Wagner. Now, incredible as it may seem, between 100 and 500 people came to his meetings in Bunker Hill, and 400 more came to his meetings in Rochester. Here we have the Bourbon Evangelical United Brethren Church, which is where the meetings were actually held. And then over 1,000 people flocked to his tent at Bourbon, with several dozen converts resulting. In fact, in the newspapers, ministers of other denominations were complaining because they couldn't get an audience on Sunday morning. Everybody was going to hear the Adventists in their tent, and they weren't coming to church on Sunday morning. At each place, Elder Lane organized Bible study classes and baptized converts. Sands Lane and H.M. Kenyon teamed up in 1875 to give 36 lectures in Leesburg and Ligonier. And here you recognize, of course, the famous Pink House in Ligonier. I believe it's still standing. Despite bitterly cold weather that spring, between 100 and 400 people attended their meetings, which lasted 5 weeks. Attendees gave $6 to purchase oil and wood to heat the church building. And when the weather warmed up in June, they transferred their gatherings to a 60-foot tent, into which 200 to 700 attendees crowded every single night for 6 weeks. You get that kind of results here in Anderson when you hold evangelistic meetings? I doubt it. I doubt it. 200 to 700 every single night for 6 weeks. They filled every seat. Nearly 100 came to the Sabbath Bible classes, including many members of the 30 Jewish families who owned all the businesses in Ligonier and who for the first time closed their shops on Sabbath. They weren't very observant Jews, were they? Because they didn't close their shops before the Adventists came to town. But they did for the Sabbath meetings. From this one series, 43 converts voted to keep the Sabbath. 32 of them signed the covenant. We may want to explore what the covenant is tonight or this afternoon at 4 o'clock. And 27 subscribed to the Review and Herald. Later that summer, H.M. Kenyon and James Harvey took their tent to Albion, with between 100 and 300 people attending. Meanwhile, W.W. Sharp preached in the schoolhouses at Inwood, Syracuse, and West Liberty to eager listeners. There were so many people eager to hear the Adventist message that in 1876, the Indiana Conference actually ran 2 evangelistic tents. Not 1, but 2. Sands Lane, James Harvey, and Brother Minor took 1 tent to Marian, Peru, Valparaiso, Jalapa, and Bunker Hill, distributing handbills at every home and using a large blackboard to illustrate their lectures. Crowds of between 600 and 1,000 people, 8 to 10 people deep, surrounded their tent and crammed into the aisles during the rainstorms. When Lane preached about the new earth, this is the same Lane who lived up in Battle Creek and commuted down here into Indiana, he would slap his prosthetic leg and tell the people how he would leap like a hart in heaven. Your first Indiana Conference president had a wooden leg. Yeah. In Marian, the Chronicle advertised their meetings and printed their lectures on Daniel and Revelation. And the newspaper put it this way: to say the least, the interpretations the reverend gentleman gives of these apparently unfathomable writings, referring to Daniel and Revelation, are reasonable and consistent, if not absolutely convincing. The Marian series reaped 20 converts and the formation of the Marian Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so today, the Adventists over there in Marian can claim to be the second oldest Adventist church in Indiana. The second oldest, Marian, Indiana. And then Lane and Arthur Bartlett teamed up to preach to about 100 eager listeners in Peru and 250 more in Perrysburg. And they spoke to Germans and Norwegians and Swedes for 2 weeks. Well, William Colbert and W.W. Sharp took the second tent over to Slash and West Liberty, where it too soon filled with nearly 100 curious listeners at the 28 lectures that the men delivered. 7 converts began keeping the Sabbath in West Liberty, and about 15 in Slash, where they expected to organize a church relatively soon. As 1877 opened, the conference decided to run 2 more tents, a much-used 52-foot tent and a brand-new 60-foot tent. A.W. Bartlett took 1 tent to Perrysburg, Ronan, and Deedsville, where he and Sands Lane organized a company of those whom Bartlett described as firmly established, except for one man who, he said, I'm sorry to say, has turned to the beggarly elements of the world. Lane also held meetings in a Methodist Episcopal church in Waterford. Tract sold quickly there, and the local newspapers printed all of his lectures. And then Lane, Bartlett, and Brother Caldwell teamed up for 7 weeks of evangelism in Darlington. Now, you need to understand that Darlington in the 1870s was a tiny little hamlet of only 300 people. But 400 people crammed their tent. So you know they're getting everybody in town plus the farmers for miles around. 400 people crammed their tent for those meetings. And there was singing because the local Protestants donated an organ to their tent. And then they went to Thorntown, which was a village of about 2,000 people at that time, of whom between 450 and 600 came out to their meetings. And the evangelists described them as above the average in intelligence and morality. Wouldn't that be nice if that was how the Anderson Seventh-day Adventists were described in the Lake Union Herald? Above the average in intelligence and morality. That's something to aspire to. Some 250 humans, besides 95 horses, came to hear a discourse on the Eastern question. Now, that was a hot-button issue. The Eastern question involved Turkey in Bible prophecy, the fall of Turkey. Elder Caldwell was shocked when he called for a vote on the Sabbath truth to see a celebrated spiritualist in central Indiana stand to his feet, not once, but twice, to vote that he believed the seventh day was the Sabbath. We don't have the man's name, but he's described in the Adventist Adventist paper as one of the leading spiritualists in central Indiana, standing up to testify that he believed the seventh day was the Sabbath. The men also formed Bible study classes after their meetings for the 60 participants, 20 of whom signed the covenant to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. 10 were baptized. At subsequent meetings that fall, hundreds of eager listeners filled the benches, while 120 horses munched grass outside the tent. Meanwhile, W.W. Sharp, William Covert, and J.M. Rees took tent number 2 to Somerset and Peoria. That was just a tiny little hamlet of about 100 people. But 400 people showed up at their meetings. The math just doesn't compute. You're pitching a tent in a hamlet of 100 people, and 400 people show up to the meetings. People from miles around must have come, and 10 converts soon began keeping the Sabbath. Teamwork provided the best strategy for winning souls in the 1870s. Following this approach, W.W. Sharp, Victor Thompson, and F.D. Allen packed the Methodist Episcopal Church over in Yorktown for 10 lectures in January and February of 1878, despite the Methodist pastor's concern that their preaching would break up his congregation. As a friendly ecumenical gesture, therefore, Elder Sharp took up an offering of $20 to repair the Methodist church. Wasn't that nice of the Adventist pastor to do that? Now, $20 is equivalent to $500 today. Raising an offering of $500 to help the Methodists with their leaky roof. Shortly after moving to the local schoolhouse in Yorktown, about 18 converts were keeping the Sabbath, and 8 of them signed the covenant. Summer tent meetings in Alexandria. That's a little closer to your home here, isn't it? Alexandria is just up the interstate. Drew 300 listeners to hear 60 discourses. 25 started keeping the Sabbath, 16 signed the covenant, and 3 were baptized. Another team, formed with Elder Lane, J.S. Schrock, and J.T. Richards, went to Friendship, Dillsboro, LaGrange County, Reese's Mill, Noblesville, and Bogstown in the winter and spring of 1878. Despite muddy roads, large crowds of between 80 and 250 people attended their meetings in the town hall and local churches. That spring, the men organized a company of 11 Adventists in Friendship, the first in southeast Indiana. Later that summer, between 300 and 450 citizens from Reese's Mills heard the Adventist message. 35 of them began keeping the Sabbath, 8 signed the covenant, and the local postmaster, who voted in favor of Sabbath keeping, chose to resign his position rather than break the Sabbath on the seventh day. You see, post offices were open all day Saturday, closed Sunday, open all day Saturday in the 19th century. So he resigned his position. One teacher at the nearby Normal School, that's a school that trains teachers, stated, "I cannot resist this great truth." He planned to attend Battle Creek College in the near future. Now, over at Noblesville, and here's an old photograph I found online of Noblesville, between 200 and 450 people packed the tent, giving $13 to pay all of the minister's expenses, including the operation of a small printing press that generated handbills to advertise their meetings. The generous citizens of Noblesville even provided fresh flowers every night for the podium. I think that town is well named. There are a lot of noble people in Noblesville, at least back then. About 15 of them embraced the Sabbath, 36 signed the covenant, 40 promised to live out the whole truth. Later that fall, William Covert and J.M. Reeves preached in the Academy building over at Frankton for 4 weeks, resulting in 14 voting to keep the Sabbath, 23 signing the covenant, and 10 being baptized in the freezing water of a nearby river in mid-November. Remember, we have no warm baptismal tanks. Nowhere. You're going to be baptized by immersion. It's in a lake, a pond, or a river, and sometimes they had to break the ice to baptize you. When Lane returned to Noblesville that fall, he preached in the old 1837 red brick courthouse to an appreciative crowd, and that's what it looked like in its high day. As the decade came to a close, 4 ministerial teams fanned out across the conference in 1879. J.S. Schrock, J.M. Reeves, and Victor Thompson entered Springfield, Eden Valley, Warrington, and Grant City. After giving 21 lectures in Springfield, 18 listeners began attending weekly Sabbath meetings, with 5 of them fully embracing the Sabbath truth. Between 75 and 200 people attended their meetings at Eden Valley, where the 3 men formed a good choir, they called it. We call it a trio, a good choir, who sang from Edson White and Frank Belden's new song, Anchor, published in 1878. So this was a brand new hymn book that they were distributing to sing from. This was the first Adventist hymn book, by the way, to contain both the words and the musical notation. Previous hymn books for us Adventists only had the words. You had to have the tune memorized because they didn't give you the notes. They only gave you the words. But here the song Anchor has both words and music. Between 100 and 500 citizens came to their tent meetings at Warrington, praising the 3 men for teaching nothing but the Bible truth. After 2 weeks and 36 lectures at Grant City, with between 100 and 300 people attending their meetings, 50 of them began keeping the Sabbath, and 9 signed the covenant. Meanwhile, William Covert and J.P. Henderson preached in schoolhouses and churches in Franklin, where they baptized 5 converts, Arcadia, where between 100 and 200 people attended, 13 converted to Adventism, and many of them brought fresh flowers every night, and Cicero. Perhaps you've heard of Cicero, a tiny little village with hardly anybody in it 150 years ago. But 6 or 8 individuals began keeping the Sabbath there, and 2 of them signed the covenant that fall. Sands Lane had to move his growing audience into the Methodist Church in Salem Center. He drew between 150 and 350 listeners at his summer tent meetings in Warsaw, a village of about 3,000 citizens, many of whom brought fresh flowers to adorn the platform each evening. Very kind gesture, I think. Soon 30 of them were attending Sabbath gatherings. Following his meetings over at Wolf Lake, where some of the 300 to 500 attendees traveled 10 to 15 miles by horse and buggy to hear him speak. 4 converts were baptized in the nearby lake. Over at Silver Lake, a hamlet with only 600 inhabitants, W.W. Sharp and S. Rogers preached to an average of 125 very friendly listeners every night. Some of them furnished them with an organ and an organist to play the hymns during their meetings, and they more than paid for all their expenses. 9 souls voted to keep the Sabbath. Although Sevastopol claimed to have only 150 inhabitants 150 years ago, between 175 and 200 local citizens attended Sharp and Rogers meetings. In an unprecedented show of ecumenical spirit, the local pastor even suspended his Sunday services and brought his entire congregation to the tent night after night. That is almost unprecedented. As we're going to see when we get into the 1880s, particularly, local ministers usually fought hard against Adventist preachers. Here's one who's bringing his whole congregation night after night. About 40 merchants, harness makers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, and even the local undertaker closed their shops so they could attend the meetings. Soon 12 of them were keeping the Sabbath. Another 12 to 15 gave cheering testimonies of their walk with Jesus. And many profane men who were accustomed to taking Christ's name in vain, as they cursed and swore, now began to use Jesus' name reverently in their prayers, and they read their Bibles very frequently. The vigorous evangelistic efforts of these brave preaching teams not only exhausted them, but also wore out their tents. In February of 1879, President Lane made an urgent plea for $325 to buy a new tent and replace the top for another old tent, offering potential donors what we would call today a quid pro quo. If you've heard that old Latin phrase, it means this for that, all right, quid pro quo. He promised that those congregations who gave the largest offerings would be guaranteed to have tent meetings held in their area. So in other words, be generous and we'll send the conference tent to your area first. The astounding success of these evangelists in attracting large crowds and converting hundreds of them to Adventism did not go unnoticed. During the 1870s, bitter opposition began to arise from the mainstream churches, especially among the disciples of Christ and the Methodists, and to a lesser extent by the United Brethren and the Lutherans. The tactics used to thwart the Adventist preachers' success included closing their church doors to Adventist meetings, challenging them to debates. I imagine your pastor has never engaged in a debate with a non-Adventist preacher, preaching against them in their pulpits, spreading lies about them, and forbidding their congregants to attend the tent meetings. Hands down, the disciples of Christ ministers were the most vehement and vigorous opponents of Adventist evangelists. They threw down the gauntlet concerning the Sabbath, the state of the dead, and the perpetuity of God's law before every Adventist minister they met. Here's a partial list of the debates in the 1870s. All right? Sands Lane, J.H. Wagner, A.W. Bartlett, J.P. Henderson, J.M. Rees faced disciples of Christ debaters. Some of them were professional debaters, all right, taking on Adventist ministers at all of these places. Local disciples of Christ pastors invited professional debaters from their denomination to come and engage Adventist evangelists in debates that often lasted for 1, 2, or even 3 weeks. Weeks. For example, the disciples in Lancaster hired William F. Treat, a famous debater who participated in 25 theological debates. They hired him to take on Elder Sands Lane in June of 1871. The local citizens raised $25 to cover all the expenses of the debate. But when the contest ended, the majority of those present voted that Adventist evangelist Elder Lane had won the debate because his knowledge of the Bible was so superior to that of the disciples of Christ, professional debater. As a result of those debates, 5 listeners converted to Adventism. Not far behind the disciples of Christ were the Methodists. And here's a partial list of the Methodist debates with Adventist ministers in Indiana. And you see Sands Lane and A.W. Bartlett and W.W. Sharp and Victor Thompson being challenged by the Methodist pastors of all these various towns and villages. Pastors of other denominations were either less numerous or less determined to combat Adventist evangelists. For example, the record shows only one United Brethren minister debating with Sands Lane at Bourbon in 1874. And here is the church. The Bourbon Evangelical United Brethren Church is where that debate took place. I think it's still standing today. For example, the record shows only one United Brethren minister debating with Sands Lane. Presbyterian pastors debated or opposed Arthur Bartlett at Perrysburg in 1876, W.W. Sharp at Yorktown in 78, Sands Lane at Fowler in 79. Also in 1879, the Lutheran pastor in Silver Lake preached against the Seventh-day Sabbath, which W.W. Sharp was teaching in his tent meetings. However, summing up, there are 4 lessons that many local pastors and professional debating experts were slow to learn. 4. Number 1, Adventist pastors and evangelists knew their Bibles far better than the ministers in the mainstream churches did. Number 2, Adventists always won these debates in the eyes of the audience. See, the audience would vote. They'd cast votes as to who they thought won. They always favored the Adventist evangelists. Number 3, conversions to Adventism often follow these debates. And number 4, as one pastor discovered in his contest with Elder William Covert at Slash in 1877, he learned that he was ruining his own cause by continuing the debate. He was losing, and it was better for him to go home. It was not uncommon, in fact, for some audience members to boo or hiss debaters from their own church if they felt that these men did not know their Bibles very well. You imagine that? Booing and hissing your own pastor. If that pastor twisted the facts, if that pastor resorted to name-calling or advanced illogical arguments, they would boo or hiss. Well, debates featured a form of verbal opposition. Occasionally, Adventist ministers faced outright violence, and this may shock you. All right, here's a map of Peru. During Sands Lane's meeting in Peru in 1876, ruffians threatened to pour gasoline on his tent and burn it down if he didn't leave town immediately. After praying about the matter, Lane decided to stand his ground, and he slept in his tent to protect it at night. How brave they were. Lane and James Harvey's meetings in Peru were also disrupted by the hotly contested 1876 national election debates between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Now, I realize that's a very obscure political debate, but it was very hot at the time. The political excitement is so great, Elder Lane wrote in the review, it's almost impossible to arrest the attention of the people and focus them on spiritual matters. 2 years later, W.W. Sharp, then holding meetings at Yorktown, rejoiced that the interest is better than at any time in the past, but regretted that the opposition is bitter and the secret kind, which is hard to meet. That is slander, lying. Sometimes it was easier to face one's opponent in a theological debate than it was to deal with whispered rumors, sly innuendos, and secret pressures not to attend the Adventist meetings. Finally, while A.W. Bartlett was preaching in Ronan in the spring of 1877, and while Sharp and his tent master, S. Rogers, was trying to hold meetings over in Silver Lake during the summer of 79, they noticed a decline in attendance due to the scarlet fever epidemic sweeping both areas. At other times, it was Mother Nature that thwarted the efforts of Adventist evangelists. As every one of you knows, Indiana is often subject to torrential downpours in spring and summer months. Elbert and Sands Lane faced unseasonably cold and rainy weather during their meetings in New London, Roosevelt, Sugar Grove, and Moores Creek in the summer of 1870. Preaching over in Valparaiso for 3 weeks in July of 1876, Sands Lane and James Harvey sometimes had to cancel meetings due to the heavy rainstorms lashing the region. William Covert and J.P. Henderson also faced constant rain during their tent meetings in Arcadia in July of 1879, a tempest that arrived just as the farmers were ready to harvest their wheat. Later that fall, as Elder Covert labored in Madison County, heavy rains halted his meetings, so he instead went door to door, selling Adventist books and magazines instead. Of course, during the winter, the early spring, blizzards and falling temperatures could also prevent people from coming to their meetings. Elder J.H. Wagner was forced by blizzards to hold meetings in a heated public hall in Henry County in January of 1872. 3 months later, in April, he was still battling cold and deep snow in Burlington, North Liberty, and Fairfield. So he transferred his meetings over to a nearby schoolhouse and then to a private home. Heavy rains and drifting snow likewise made the country roads muddy morasses. While working in the North Liberty area in June of 1873, Sands Lane for 5 weeks trudged over roads he described as almost impassable on account of the mud. In fact, the mud was so deep the horses couldn't get through it. That's what your roads used to look like here in Indiana. Muddy morasses. So what did the people do? They walked through the cornfield. They walked through the cornfield instead of on the roads. He faced the same muddy conditions during an early spring thaw in 1878 while attending quarterly meetings in Alto. Deep mud, however, did not deter one hardy Adventist woman who actually hiked 7 miles over very muddy roads to attend Elder Lane services at Salem Center in the spring of 1879. You see, it was only with the arrival of the automobile in the 1920s that Indiana's roads got better. Only in the 1920s would the roads be improved. So I think on that note, we'll just conclude. We'll pick up with the churches and the companies that were organized here in Indiana during the 1870s when we come back together at 4 o'clock. And then we'll also talk about who built the first Adventist meeting houses in Indiana. And I'll share that list with you as well. All right?